One of the most important things that connects us is story. Regardless of the relationships we share with family or friends or colleagues, or the location where those relationships play out, home, school, work, clubs, it is the common story that we share that serves to undergird that connection. It is the spoken and unspoken glue. The family into which I married demonstrates this every time we gather. Put another way, my in-laws love to share their family stories. When I first met them, I was welcomed into the family through the sharing of treasured memories. During my father-in-law's experience of dementia, these same stories were repeated as an affirmation of his life and as a tether for him. And now that we have a young child, these stories are once again shared to help Thomas know more about his family. There have been times, I must admit, that I have playfully teased my wife about this, as I come from a family that does not quite embrace this tradition as fully as hers. And so I'm not quite as comfortable with it all the time. Yet when I am completely honest, I have to admit that I sort of love it. Don't tell my mother-in-law. As it has allowed me to really get to know these now family members and to understand them more fully. Plus, I am amazed at how closely my son, who has the attention span of a 3-year-old, listens when his mother or his grandmother or his aunts are telling him a family story. He even asks me to tell him stories about my side of the family, so I've had to ratchet up my game a little bit. These stories are the backbone of the family, the foundation of our relationship. Story, as we know, is quite powerful. Story fuels our memories. Story exemplifies our values. Story captures our imagination as we are invited to place ourselves into the narrative to see where we might fit in. It's the same in our family of faith, both locally and universally. In the Christian faith, we know that there exists a great continuum along which people fall in relation to their specific beliefs. Yet no matter how one might interpret it, whether you read the Bible literally or metaphorically or somewhere in between, we share a common story, and that story connects us as followers of Christ. There's actually an entire theological movement based on this idea. Narrative theology, also known as post-liberal theology, has its core the claim that the common narrative, the story of Christianity, is what undergirds our faith. Through this story, we will share common language, common values, a common sense of purpose, for these aspects of our faith are embedded in the story. And my friends, it is a good story. It's a story of God's relationship with the world, and more specifically, the people who have made up that world over time. Through this story, we are reminded about the nature of humanity. And we can see that this nature is consistent. Simply, while times change, people tend to act like people. But more than that, we come to understand the nature and character of God. And we see the various demonstrations of how God is involved in our world and in our lives. At the heart of that story is the life of Jesus, whose birth we celebrate at Christmas and whose resurrection we celebrate today. And in that life story, we find a demonstration of the unconditional love that we are called to embrace in our own lives. We find a reminder of the forgiveness we are encouraged to give and receive in our relationships with one another. We experience a sense of the concern we are invited to show for others in the midst of a culture that champions selfishness. And we hear a call to unity in the face of a troubling pattern of growing divisiveness. Even in the relatively small portion of Jesus' life that we remember on Holy Week, we get a glimpse of that unconditional love in the sacrifice on the cross. We hear echoes of forgiveness in Jesus' words, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." We perceive the condemnation of selfishness in the scene at the temple. And we hear distinctly a call to unity in Jesus' prayer for his disciples on their last night together. And it is at the climax of this story that we witness the unimaginable power of God, a power embodying God's love for the world and the promise that even in the most dire circumstances, there is always hope. It is at the climax of this story that we learn of the wonder of the resurrection. I don't recall the exact number, but I do believe it's less than 10. But the theory I heard suggests that there are really only a handful of storylines that exist in all of literature. Everything we read or hear or watch represents various versions or interpretations or combinations of a fairly small set of plot lines. That is one reason why story is such a powerful and effective vehicle. With such a limited number of plot lines, it is likely that we will be able to identify with the stories we hear. For we have likely experienced something similar in our own lives or in the broader stories of our families. So when we take the step to place ourselves into the narrative, that process is much easier because the connection is that much greater. Perhaps we may believe that an exception to this is the story of the resurrection. For most of the stories we read or hear or share with others are about human beings doing human things. Yes, sometimes exceptional human beings, but human nonetheless. But the story of the resurrection confounds that trend, for this is something outside of our human experience. It's beyond our human expectation. This is something extraordinary. This is something, an act that only God can accomplish. As a result, it's something that's not so easily embraced. We see this in the midst of the story itself, as Mary, who was among the closest of Jesus' followers, has an incredibly difficult time accepting the reality with which she is faced. Expecting to simply grieve outside the tomb of her friend and teacher, she finds herself taking a roller coaster ride of emotions that travels the entire gamut. It begins with grief, moves through moments of fear, excitement, despair, and finally elation. And as we know, when confronted with this story, we find a wide variety of interpretation among Christians across the centuries and still today. Yet, as I mentioned previously, regardless of whether you are someone who believes in the literal bodily resurrection or someone who holds a more metaphorical understanding, connecting with the symbolism of resurrection, this fantastic moment represents a key point in our Christian story. It testifies to the power of God, yes, but more importantly, it testifies to the character of God, who does not, will not, abandon the people of God regardless of the circumstances. And it speaks to the loving and supportive presence of Christ, which remains with us always. And despite what could be a disconnect, as this is, as I mentioned, something beyond human doing, I believe there is an ability for us to connect to this story as well. Because we have all, at one time or another, felt lost or powerless. We have all had an experience of despair. And in those moments, be it literally or figuratively, we have reached out, seeking solace and comfort, seeking answers, or simply seeking hope. And someone has reached back. Perhaps it was following the loss of a loved one, and there was a feeling of emptiness. And in the midst of grief, someone came to spend time with you, not offering platitudes or distractions, but simply a caring presence. You reached out. Someone reached back. Perhaps you learned of the illness of your child or a condition that would challenge them and you as a parent. And in the midst of feeling overwhelmed by life, someone brought you a meal or offered a prayer, or provided a non-judgmental listening ear. You reached out, and someone reached back. Perhaps you unexpectedly lost your job and were suddenly concerned for your ability to support your family. And in the midst of the worry and maybe even shame, someone provided an encouraging message of hope or turned you on to a new opportunity. You reached out, and someone reached back. It can take many different forms. It can be something small and simple. It can be something much bigger, more complex. No matter the scope, when someone reaches back to us in our times of need, it is incredibly significant, deeply meaningful. It has the power to be a life-altering experience. It has the power to change our story. So on the surface, while this aspect of our faith story, this incredible act of God, may seem beyond our ability to identify, I might suggest that in reality, it is not. It is part of the story we all know because we have all been there. You will recall from the story of the resurrection that all of the wonder and awe that we tend to remember is not actually present in the story. For while we imagine an incredible divine light show, scored, of course, by John Williams, what we really have is an open tomb, some folded clothes, 2 white-clad figures, and a beloved friend. All other aspects we might want to recall are things we read into the story. Perhaps because we assume that God is a go big or go home kind of deity, or perhaps because we know from our own experience, from our own stories, just how powerful such moments can be. For the power of the resurrection is the presence of care and support when one is feeling alone. The power of the resurrection is the presence of love when love seemed to be gone. The power of the resurrection is the promise of hope when hope seemed lost. The power of the resurrection is an experience of God reaching back when we are reaching out. Happy Easter. Amen.